If you are an oldest sibling, you have likely noticed that the book of Genesis has a certain hostility towards us firstborn children. The Torah assumes that its audience expects the privileging of the firstborn and delights in overturning that expectation. Primogeniture, the system in which an oldest son inherits the main estate, with younger sons left with a substantially smaller portion, if any, is overturned time after time. Think of the stories of Cain and Abel, Ishmael and Isaac, Jacob and Esau, Leah and Rachel, Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph and his brothers. In each of these families, the younger sibling becomes the favored one, favored by parents or by God or by a husband. Many other key figures of Jewish tradition are younger sons: Moses, David, Solomon. Biblical scholar Robert Alter comments that the firstborn very often seem to be losers in Genesis by the very condition of their birth. So before exploring why the Torah stories might overturn primogeniture, let me give the system its due explanation. Like any reliably upheld system, it made for familial and communal stability. If property were to be equally distributed among descendants, very soon land would be so hyper-fragmented as to become useless, too tiny to support anyone. The firstborn office came with both financial privileges and responsibilities. After a father's death, the firstborn son was to support his family, his widowed mother, unmarried sisters, and, as we see through extensive biblical law and stories about levirate marriage, any widowed sisters-in-law. In Exodus, the firstborn is called the Peter Rechem, the one who opened the womb. A firstborn is the first fruit to be consecrated to God. The firstborn, by establishing familial continuity, symbolizes all that is to come. He is seen as a particular blessing to the family, so much so that although King Solomon is a second-born son, in Psalms we read that God will appoint him Bechor, the firstborn. To be firstborn is to be imbued with honor and responsibility. And yet, Jacob, the patriarch who will become Israel, the man Yisrael who represent Am Yisrael, is second-born. So take this week's Parsha, Toldot. Even before the twins Esau and Jacob are born, their parents, and we, the readers, know that the second-born son will be the mightier son. When their mother, Rebekah, is pregnant, and the boys seem to crush each other in her womb, she cries out to God. God answers her, and God tells her, V'rav ya'avod sa'ir, the older shall serve the younger. Rebekah's later machinations to have Jacob steal the firstborn blessing are in service of this divine decree: Esau will serve Jacob. And God can decide things like this because God is sovereign. God doesn't have to play by the rules of primogeniture or any other system that we mortals devise to make life more orderly and predictable. Matthew Schultz teaches that only the arbitrary nature of love explains overturning birth order destiny. He quotes Bereshit Rabbah, a midrashic collection on the book of Genesis. Love upsets the natural order. Schultz explains that love in Genesis is the greatest source of chaos and strife. So divine love is what overturns primogeniture. God's love isn't a function of meritocracy. We see again and again in the Torah how God's favored ones have the same flaws, limitations, egotistical impulses as anyone else. But love introduces unpredictability into the system. Love is a great disorderly force. Lest we infer that Judaism fully rejects primogeniture, I would caution against assuming law from a portion of Torah, like this week's Parsha, whose nature is literary narrative. Stories with clear legal relevance should be read in conversation with the explicit legal passages elsewhere in our textual tradition, because the Torah does not contain only the Genesis narratives of birth order upset. In Deuteronomy, we read that the firstborn son, even if he is the son of a man's unloved wife, is allotted a double portion of the inheritance. Since he is the first fruit of his father's vigor, the birthright is his due. So imagine that a father dies, leaving behind 5 sons. The firstborn receives a third of the estate, and each of the other sons receives 1/6. How women's inheritance fits into this system is beyond the scope of the sermon tonight, but if you are interested in exploring further, please let me know. So because the firstborn son does not inherit the entirety of the estate, but rather a double portion, the Israelite Jewish system of primogeniture is less strict than some other models. The double portion principle guides extensive discussion of inheritance law in the Mishnah, Gemara, and Jewish legal commentaries. So, Genesis puts the iron law of primogeniture under a literary microscope, and then Jewish legal tradition upholds, though qualifies, the system. That is no contradiction, but rather the very function of literature. A key purpose of stories is to make abstract principles concrete and let us imagine the paths not taken. Good stories, and Torah stories are the best of the best, urge us to see parts of our world that often go unnoticed. Biblical narratives aren't a direct moral or legal guide, but rather jumping off points for big conversations. They push us to think about the type of people we want to be and the type of societies we want to live in. And so I think the birth order overhaul stories in Genesis are narrative commentaries on primogeniture. These stories work through what inheritance norms look like in practice. They spark major questions. What if the older brother is less deserving than the younger? Can we empathize with Esau or with Jacob? In inheritance, what is fair? What is workable? Can we justify the unequal love of a parent or of God? Biblical stories are not merely amusement for children and nostalgia for adults. Biblical narrative is not ancillary to biblical law. Rather, in Judaism, halakha and agadah always go hand in hand. Stories spark creative thinking. Stories elicit the moral thinking that lawmaking requires. The stories of Jewish tradition invite us to dwell in life's most essential questions. May we always accept the invitation. May we ask new questions about ourselves and our world every time we read these stories, and may we always allow ourselves to be shaped by these holy narratives. Shabbat Shalom.